Hello, great souls. Welcome to our Living Yoga Satsang, reflections on Autobiography of a Yogi. Let's begin together with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, great masters of Kriya Yoga, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, and beloved Paramhansa Yogananda Ji, saints of all religions, friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, we humbly bow to you all. Guide us in our conversation today as we reflect upon these sacred teachings. Help us to see and know the divine presence within these pages. Help us to experience our own divine nature, to awaken to our soul nature, and to be a shining channel of thy divine presence for all. Om, peace. Amen. Okay, so last week we were looking at chapter 32, Rama is raised from the dead. And I was saying last week, we just got to basically that whole story, incredible, inspiring story of the power of the divine that flows through masters as a reminder of what we are capable of ourselves, and also the power of thought, right? So Sri Yukteswar telling the story of his master, Lahiri Mahashaya, raising his friend Rama from the dead, and how Sri Yukteswar vacillated in his confidence with Rama being able to be healed, and the influence that had. So incredible chapter. I highly recommend that you read it. And if you missed the talk last week, you can go to the YouTube channel. And my name, Vivekadevi, Noh-Kuhn. You can search that and you can find it if you happen to miss it last week. It might still be on live stream as well. You can check that library. So the chapter goes on to talk about Sri Yukteswar, after he's telling this story to Yogananda, a few disciples, and some of the students from the Ranchi school that were with Yogananda. Sri Yukteswar, basically dismisses everyone except for Yogananda, and he takes Yogananda to the side and begins to say to him that, he points out to Yogananda that his life from birth has been surrounded by disciples, great disciples, including his parents of Lahiri Mahashaya. And he says to Yogananda that 50 years from now, actually, I'm trying to remember if Lahiri said this or, okay. Lahiri said this, and Yukteswar was telling this to Yogananda. So Lahiri said that 50 years after his passing, people will write about his life. So much of his life, was after meeting his guru Babaji, which we head into that, the chapters that follow this one. It talks about Babaji's life, and then it talks about Lahiri meeting Babaji, thrilling chapters. But so Lahiri Mahashaya's life was nothing had been written about it. And so Sri Yukteswar is saying to Yogananda, he's foretelling that, your life has been surrounded by great disciples of Lahiri Mahashaya, and Lahiri predicted that a hunger for yoga in the West will create an opportunity for his life to be known and for people to write about it. And Yogananda would in fact be one of those people, which Yogananda says in this book is really one of the most notable, and at the time, this was written in 1945, at that time, almost nothing had been written about Lahiri Mahashaya. I don't know how much, even from then, has been written. I've heard about a book from one of his direct disciples. Now I'm trying to think, it wouldn't have been his direct disciple, but it would have been a disciple in his lineage. So, and I can't remember the name of the book, but there is a text that's out there that I've heard about. But anyways, Yogananda is saying, as the writing of this book, Autobiography of a Yogi, there's this moment of realization that there it is 50 years later, and he's writing about, from Lahiri's passing, and he's writing about his life. So then he goes on, Yogananda, in the chapter to talk about the timing of kind of, he points out that since Lahiri's passing and the writing of Autobiography of a Yogi, 2 world wars have taken place. And Yogananda is making the point in the chapter that the way to resolving conflict is not through war, that we will not right the wrongs of, that are happening within the world by fighting through violence. We won't get there that way. And he's saying, you know, we've had 2 world wars to prove that. And now, he points out, we've moved into the atomic age, where the stakes are extraordinarily high for literally obliterating humanity, right? So he's talking about that and just pressing the point, the answer must be found within. And he ushers the, he uses that as a threshold to talk about what yoga offers us, what Lahiri brought to us. And the path of yoga, the practices and teachings of yoga, and the highest technique of that being Kriya Yoga. The idea, what Yogananda's pointing out here, is what happens with the practice of yoga is inner communion. So he's saying there's a I'll just read some of his words from the chapter. It's not through cruelty will humanity find peace. Let's see, the effective League of Nations will be a natural, nameless league of human hearts. The broad sympathies and discerning insight needed for healing the earthly woes cannot flow from a mere intellectual consideration of man's diversities, but from knowledge of man's soul unity in kinship with God. So I want to focus on this point here. It's something that Yogananda and Swami Kriyananda spoke of often, which is, it is the practice of yoga, the personal experience of the fruits of yoga that change us, not the mere intellectual understanding of it. So in the Raja Yoga course, we talk, and this comes from Yogananda's teachings, there's the art and the science of yoga. And the science is the practice. It is our personal practice of working with the tools, working with the philosophy through spiritual practice in our own life, and then watching it transform us and awaken us to our soul nature, to the divine light that shines within us. One of the famous things that Yogananda said at a gathering, I'm sure I've mentioned it before in one of our classes, one of our talks, and I've heard many other teachers mention it, it never gets old for me, which is Yogananda looking out to everyone and saying, if you could see yourself as I see you, you would see that you are divine light. That's all that you are, is divine light. We are a perfect reflection of the divine, a spark of divinity. That is our essence. And so yoga, which actually means union, it's union with our divine self. So the point that Yogananda is making here is that there's kind of 2 pieces to it. One is the stakes are very high, that, you know, we're in a situation where if we don't correct our course, we are, the whole civilization is in danger of being annihilated. Earlier, let's see if it's earlier, no, it's a little bit later then, he goes back to the Bible, which is something we talked about earlier in this chapter. So he goes back, he returns to the Bible is what I would say. And in this case, he returns to the Old Testament. And he talks about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham is saying to God, will you please spare the city? And let me go there to that part. So the biblical story of Abraham's plea to the Lord that the city of Sodom be spared, if 10 righteous men can be found therein. And the divine reply, God says to Abraham, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. So if you can find 10 people who are righteous people, who love God, who live for God, who are dedicated to a holy life, then they will spare the whole civilization, that whole city. And what Yogananda said is, this is the heart of India, that the reason that India, thousands of years of civilization have been preserved, where other cultures, other civilizations, Egypt, other things, they faded. Rome, right, is one of the examples as well, where you have these civilizations with so much achievement, and you would feel that they would, it seems natural from outer material achievement that they would stand the test of time, but they don't. And India has. And the reason, and what Yogananda's talking about here, is what has been preserved within the Indian culture. So within the culture, Yogananda called India the guru of this planet, meaning it holds the spiritual power because there were many righteous men and women living in India. There is a sense, I have not visited there in this lifetime, so we'll see if it's in, we say in our karma to get there, we'll see if it's my dharma or karma to get to India in this lifetime. But I certainly have many Indian friends, and I'm this path which Yogananda brought was the power of these spiritual teachings. So the West, he said, had, it's what Sri Yukteswar gave to Yogananda to come here, is to bring these two cultures together. So the West has the ingenuity and the material advancement, and we talked about this earlier in Autobiography, Yogi, some beautiful chapters on how the East and West come together. It's much more common that we see that now. It was really radical when Yogananda was talking about it, of how these two civilizations have so much to offer each other, the East and the West. So the idea here of 10 righteous individuals, really what Yogananda is bringing back to our attention is that even a small number of dedicated individuals, those committed to spiritual principles, have the power, the spiritual power of salvation for many. I'm reminded in this moment of, I was at a conference for social justice, and it was the first time I had heard someone talk about this concept, that it really only takes a small number of dedicated individuals to change the world, to create a movement and to bring about remarkable change. And then that the person speaking at the conference I was at, and again, I've heard this repeated, he said, the truth is, not only is it true that it only requires a small number, very often that's all there is a small number, right? That's always been true. This man was speaking about the civil rights movement, and he was saying that, when you look at the movement, it seems like, his point, again, so I'll just stick to that, is that there were a small number of dedicated individuals who got that movement off the ground and kept that movement going. And it did change our country. And part of his point, and I was at this conference for social justice, we haven't fully realized the dream of Dr. King's dream. That's really our own dream, our own soul dream. As Yogananda said here, it's the League of Nations. What's going to change the world is the League of Hearts. And it's not only that we have an understanding and appreciation of diversity, that we get the concept, but that we actually have within us this inner reality of union with all, of kinship with all. And that's what happens with yoga. So a small number of dedicated individuals, it's a powerful message of hope. Sometimes, and I've certainly seen this myself on the spiritual journey, there are these phases you can go through, and one of the phases is really feeling alone, feeling like no one else is holding on to these ideals. Sometimes even in a spiritual community, a religious community, a church that you go to, or a synagogue. And I've had many friends talk about this, where they went to something that should have provided that kind of spiritual nourishment, but it wasn't providing it for them. And so part of their journey was to be seeking the spiritual family, the spiritual community, the spiritual, not just the teachings, but the people that would walk with them. And it doesn't have to be a lot of people. It can be one person. I'm reminded of a philosophy teacher I had in college who was telling me, and she was such a delight, and she just loved philosophy, and she was a wonderful teacher, and was saying to me that her journey was philosophy. Those were the higher ideals of her life, and her friends were her books, many of the philosophers who had passed, but they were still living for her. And she recognized that I loved her class and appreciated her as a teacher. So one day on break, she happened to see me studying and came up and talked with me. And she felt a kinship with me, which was very touching to me, and was just saying, there aren't many. That's what she was saying to me. There aren't many who are so inspired by the great thinkers. And I too was very inspired by them. So that was part of, I can look back now and see, yes, that was part of my spiritual journey, being drawn to those who were trying to understand what we say in our Sunday service every week. For what end were we made? Who am I in reality? For what end was I made? And the philosophers, to me, were asking these kinds of questions and finding their way to truth, right? So I'll come back to so Yogananda's talking about, what we need is to be able to challenge ourselves to move beyond an intellectual relationship with anything, any of the spiritual teachings. And absolutely this includes yoga. The point of yoga is not to know it, not to be able to expound it, not to have lots of knowledge, right? But to have a relationship with that knowledge that is a tangible awakening of our own highest self. And that's the litmus test. So I also want to put this in very simple terms, something that's helped me, that Swami Kriyananda has talked about, because if I use the bar of Yogananda or Christ or any of the masters to see if I'm growing, that's a pretty high bar. And it's very easy to kind of look at them and see where it seems like I'm not. Like, wow, I'm not there. I don't have that. So instead of that, to look for much smaller expressions of my own highest self. I'm reminded of, we have a talk this Wednesday, part of the 12 Days of Christmas, depending on when you're watching this talk. There's an evening on the saints, and I'll be talking about Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And her life is very inspiring to me and always has been. And one of the quotes of hers that has been both a comfort and a guideline for my life, which is, this is her quote, "None of us can do great things. all we can do are small things with great love. And that kind of turning it so that it puts it within our reach to say, okay, well, how do I be part of the 10? What does that even mean, to be part of the 10? The 10 righteous who could save civilization. Well, what Yogananda said is that when someone was commenting one time about their own karma and not feeling very worthy, not feeling very advanced, and they said, I don't think I have very good karma, sir. And he became very strong in his response to him, and it's been a message that has been shared, again, many times. I've heard Ananda teachers talk about this, basically to shake all of us to a place of realization. Yogananda was saying, to even want to know God, forget feeling like you know it, forget this inner realization, the science, like, okay, I'm practicing, but is anything happening? Just to want to practice it is very, 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 very good karma, to even want to know God. So that tells us that we are well on our way. We're well on our way. And so we take that in terms of being one of the 10 righteous, like, okay, so we're bringing a lot of blessing to the world, is the point that Yogananda's making in the chapter that I'm sharing with you today, that I'm taking as a solace for myself. This reminder, it can seem very small, our own individual life. Well, what difference am I making in the world? Now, maybe it's very obvious to you, right? Sometimes it is. Sometimes we're doing work or raising a family, doing things that you feel it. You feel this is very important. It's been my experience for myself, and oftentimes with others, I can fall into the thought it doesn't seem like enough, right? Or is it enough, what I'm doing? And what Yogananda is saying is that be committed to your spiritual life. So there is a strong message here. Be committed to that. That's the only thing that will change as he said, heal the woes, the ills of the earth. Of the humanity. That's the only thing that will change it, is being committed to our spiritual life. And that commitment needs to be a personal relationship with the divine. It really needs to be a commitment to awaken and experience within us the divine. So now I'll come back to, small measures. And the small measure, what Kriyananda said in Raja Yoga, with the awakening of the self, which is awakening of the Kundalini in yoga teachings, he said a kind thought, a compassionate response awakens the Kundalini. So something that might seem very small, like, well, does that make me one of the righteous? Because again, that title can create a sense of distance. Right? It's very easy to feel like, well, I wouldn't say I'm that, whatever that is. Well, we are divine in our nature. So being able to recognize what Yogananda said, and this is a yogic teaching as well, that any soul, when we reach liberation, and again, I'll say this happens along the way, we are bringing divine blessing to our own birth family, and the family, they say 7 generations ahead and 7 generations behind us receive the blessing of liberation. The power of that energy. Now, I don't know if all those souls, I don't know how it works, but I know the teaching. And the idea here is that when we are committed to our own soul's journey of awakening, we are blessing our families and we are blessing the world, because we're all one. So there really is, the truth is we aren't separate. So anything each one of us is doing individually to feel a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood, to feel a sense of peace and light, to send out love, to hold goodwill toward all, that reverberates out into the world. And it's more powerful than anything else. This is what the masters have brought to us. And it's their power and their presence that's awakening us. And each one of us I think of the story in the New Testament of the hem of Jesus's robe. And I think of that with all the masters, of like holding that hem, reaching out And we don't have to hold on to much of it, right? But it's the intention that we reach toward it with a sense of receptivity. These talks are really based in this idea of being receptive to the power within these pages. When Swami Kriyananda met Yogananda, he met him because he read this book and changed his whole life. He read the book. He, days later, was on a bus traveling across the country from the East Coast to the West Coast, met Yogananda and asked to be his disciple. And he retold this story many times at the end of his life. And the power you could feel each time he told it, it was fresh, it was new for him. He met his guru, and he asked in that first meeting to be Yogananda's disciple. He'd never said anything like that in his life. He'd never even thought of being a disciple of anyone before. But it came out of his soul. And Yogananda asked him, "How did you like my book?" And Swami said, "Well, you changed my life, sir. That's why I'm here." And Yogananda told him, "It's because my vibration is in that book. And it's that living presence of Yogananda, of God, that's in these pages for each one of us." So this is the hem of the Master's robe, right? That we touch, we hold on to, we invite into ourselves, and take the challenge to nourish ourselves spiritually, to move beyond a concept. These are powerful teachings, this idea of raising the dead, to have that kind of power within us. Again, it can feel very, very distant, but the practice of yoga, meditation, chanting, prayer, satsang with divine friends, coming to talks like this, doing our best to receive the grace that's flowing our way continuously. And by welcoming that grace and being receptive to it, we do awaken. We do. And what we are doing, often very quietly, seemingly insignificantly, humbly, what we do with sincerity and love has great power in it. And that's really the message in these pages. Yogananda says a bit more in the chapter about Lahiri's life. So you can go and read that. It's very sweet. It's not a lot is said about Lahiri, but his spiritual nature is revealed and present as a young boy. It just says some facts about him that are interesting. And then kind of gives us the sense of what's coming in the next chapters, that we'll hear about Babaji, we'll learn who he is, and Lahiri's meeting of Babaji, and this great gift of yoga that Lahiri, through Babaji, through Yogananda, has brought to our world, has brought to each one of us, that we can awaken. And in Sunday service, there's a phrase, "Into our hands have been delivered the sacred keys of awakening. Abundant now is our hope." That's the message here, that Yogananda is saying, don't be distracted or by the outer world, and don't try to solve any problems in your life or in the world with, certainly not through violence, and certainly, with this outer fighting. So we can be pulled into that, but instead, go within, use the tools and practices to find peace and harmony, light and joy and unity within yourself, and shine that out into the world. That's what will change, not only our own consciousness, but all consciousness. So that's the message of this chapter, and wishing you many blessings. Great to be with you again today, and just sending lots of light and love and joy your way.